It's just exciting to observe where it's going to go, and we really don't even know what are all the potentials and then use cases. It's exciting and a little bit scary at the same time.
Hello and welcome to the Multilingual Content Podcast, where experts discuss international content management, translation, and global communication. I'm Caterina from Undertow, and today, with our founder, Nicola Calabrese, we are exploring the captivating intersection of AI and localization. In this episode, we are joined by Morana Perić, a leader in localization with the deep expertise in tech industry. Currently, she is serving as head of localization at DeepL. And with years of experience, Morana brings a wealth of knowledge to our discussion. Join us to unveil the world of AI and its effects on localization.
Hi, Morana. Welcome to the Multilingual Content Podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing really good today. Thank you. How are you, Nicola?
I'm good. And thank you for joining us today. We're going to talk about the AI localization, why AI is not enough. It's not suddenly magic and nobody needs localization anymore. Everything is done by the click of a button. But before we jump into that, can you briefly give listeners a little bit of background on you? Tell a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, for sure. So I am Croatian, currently living and working in Berlin. And at the moment, I work for DeepL, which I'm sure many of the listeners have heard of. It's a machine translation company. Before that, I worked in different, mostly marketplaces. So I worked for Get Your Guide for a while, which is also a Berlin-based company dealing with experiences. I worked for Booking.com for a while, which is one of the, I would say, the biggest marketplaces for hotels. And also, most recently, before joining DeepL, I worked for FreeNow, which is a multi-mobility and mobility company.
Yeah, that's your background is one of the reasons why we're going to talk about AI and localization, and it's not just clicking a button. So maybe we can start setting say ground concept. There's two things that sometimes are a little bit mixed up, especially at the moment, or at least outside of the localization industry, I'll say. It's machine translation and generative AI, so large language models. What's the difference there? What's the overlapping? Why the advantage and disadvantage when you use one, when you use the other usually?
Yeah, that's such a good way to start, because I think this whole kind of AI craze started in, 2022 when ChatGPT was released. And ChatGPT is basically a large language model, so it kind of falls into generative AI. But then we forget that machine translation and neural machine translation has been around since at least 2016. When Google launched it. But maybe before I kind of explain how I look at it, I also wanted to say I'm not an AI scientist, so I might use some expressions that are a little bit more kind of common folk, which I guess is also good. But so basically, I guess we could look at AI in general for a start, which is this very vast discipline where we are basically trying to develop computer systems that are performing complex tasks that are kind of requiring almost human level intelligence, right? So that's kind of the general AI umbrella under which both neural machine translation and generative AI are under. Then we have a subset that would be, let's say, a subfield that would be machine learning, which is basically trying to get machines to learn without explicitly programming them to do this. So before, if you look at normal coding, you need to encode all the actions that the machine does. And machine learning makes it possible for the machines to learn by themselves without being explicitly told what to do. This is also something that both neural machine translation and generative AI are a part of. And then also as a subset of machine learning, we have deep learning, which is still actually where neural machine translation and generative AI fall under. It's called deep learning because of these deep neural networks, which is basically kind of just a way of organizing data in a similar way that it is organized in the human brain, right? So we are putting different data concepts and they are interacting with these kind of nodes or neurons that are mimicking the way the human brains interact. So they are both subsets of deep learning, basically, and they are both trained in a similar way. So we train them to give us better outputs, and we train them by inputting different data by correcting the outputs, but by labeling the data. So we are working with these models to give us the output that we want. And basically where the distinction comes is, I think, with the output, because if you look at machine translation, neural machine translation, you always want the output to be matching the input. So input a text and you want the output to be matching this input with more or less variance. But with large language models or with generative AI, or let's say ChatGPT, or the ones that we know of, you put in an output and you get new concepts and new pieces of content as an output. So this is kind of the different use cases that they are used for. But like up until that point of, let's say, output, they are really, I mean, I wouldn't even say cousins, like I would say brother and sister. Yeah.
Yeah, so just to make sure, like, I understand the division that you're laying out is, in the case of neural machine translation, you put the input is the, let's say, English text, and you get the output that is, let's say, a German text that it's pretty much what you have in English, just say it in German.
Exactly.
While with the generative AI, you might give it you give it a prompt. So like, write me a blog post in German. Let's say if you want it in German, and you get an output that is a blog post that is quite different. It's just the result of what you prompted. Is that correct?
Exactly. Okay. Yeah, that's exactly the difference. And then, if we want to look into these like advantages or disadvantages, I think it's kind of also connected to this, because I would say if you look at machine translation, what are the advantages? Of course, you're closer to the source, and this is what you theoretically want in this, right? You have source text, you have target text, so you want it to be closely connected. But then you're maybe missing this like nuance, this creativity, this deviation that is like so dangerous. You're also missing it a little bit. And then if you look at on the Gen AI side, you do maybe get a little bit of more nuance than this, but then you have this entire new set of problems and layers of like unpredictability. You have trust that they're not so trustworthy yet. And that creates a little bit of a whole different spectrum of unexpected things. So I guess they're almost complementary and diametrically opposed in this problem sector. Yeah.
And when you look at like the limitation, the advantages and disadvantages, even from, like, say, a technical point of view, of if you want to use generative AI for translation purposes, because one could say, well, you can just ask it to translate the thing and you double check it, as you will do with a machine translation. But maybe from a technical point of view, let's say integrating that within workflows that you already have, there might be a big difference, at least at the moment so far. How does it play out? Like when you compare like integrating neural machine translation in your workflows and integrating a GPT, for example, in the workflows? I
would say at the moment, I mean, the use cases are completely different, right? Because I think everybody agrees in our industry and in the landscape that for now, neural machine translation is way more advanced and way more accurate and way better for the use case of translation, right? And then what I've seen happening and what I think is very smart is like generative AI is then used as a complementary tool. So you maybe use it to fix the source text or to help with some post editing or to help with some pieces of the workflow that could be automated with this, but not for the translation itself. So I would just say it's two different use cases at the moment from what I would also recommend and suggest.
And that's like also why, like in general, considering, let's say, AI is a general term that includes both neural machine translation and generative AI, let's say, what are the limitations relying solely on either machine translation or generative AI for content localization from your point of view?
Yeah, that's a good question. Every time I talk to somebody about it, I like to quote one of the very brilliant tweets that I've seen when this whole AI craze started. And I unfortunately don't remember who wrote it, but it said something like, the greatest danger of AI is that it gives very mediocre answers that are mistaken for being brilliant. And I think that is, if you really work with it, you realize that's really true. I think it fascinates us because it's something that we didn't expect a machine to be able to do. But at the end, these answers are just an average of all the kind of data that has been inputted on it, and they depend on which data sets machine used. So they're not brilliant, right? And to kind of cut a little bit more into the question, I think it's important to differentiate, right, between translation, localization, transcreation and what does this really mean. And at DeepL, we also always say we're a translation company, not a localization company. So these are different things that you are trying to achieve, and they are not all compatible with AI. So I always try to look at it through a prism of what kind of content are you translating or localizing or transcreating? So what is the reach for this content? What is the purpose of this content? And then based on these kind of categorizations, you can determine what is the quality level of this content that you want. So, of course, there are some pieces of content that are perfectly fine to be just, translated with either neural machine translation or with AI. But there are some pieces of content that you really don't want to leave in this workflow alone. Like you want at least post-editing, if not like completely transcreation from scratch. So I kind of think it boils down to that and really understanding what are you trying to achieve? What is the use case here, and what is the purpose of this content that we're working on, right? And that is such a big spectrum of purposes and reasons to consider.
And actually, would you mind like giving some specific example of like kind of content, kind of assets for the different, let's say, treatments? Like how would you approach, let's say, help center articles? Well, how would you approach that? User interface, how would you approach that? Website, etc. Just a couple of examples, just to give a better idea.
Yeah, for sure. I could give a good example from ages ago when I used to work for this big hotel marketplace where you could imagine we have so much content. We had millions of partners trying to get on the website and advertise their product and uploading content that they wanted to get translated as well. And they were then constantly changing it. So these were like enormous amounts of content that needed to be treated. And I think one very smart thing that was done back in the days, which was around 2015, is that we did this categorization of content. And it was based on different factors, but I would say most prominent ones were like, are people looking at this content? Is it reaching the audience? So how many views does it have from this specific language? Like if we have a use case in German, are German people from German locale actually viewing this content? Then the second thing would be, what is the purpose of it, right? Is it the purpose to just inform, right? Is it better that it's machine translated and maybe not so good as long as it gives these pieces of information? Or is this a piece of content that should be inspiring, engaging, motivating the user to do really something? And then based on this, the decision would be made. So we were machine translating everything. And then based on the use case, this would be sent into the workflow, reviewed, improved by humans. And this is also the approach that really I've seen it work in most bigger marketplaces or in bigger companies that have a lot of content. So yeah, you made a good example of, let's say, help center. So if you look at the help center content, what is the use case there, right? We want people to come and find some information, but does it really need to amaze and inspire? Probably not, right? We kind of want to mitigate calls to the call center. So this is probably a good candidate to be either machine translated or a little bit post-edited, but we don't need to invest so much more human time in this. And then if you look at marketing content, and then there's of course different also levels, let's say, or use cases for marketing content, or maybe even UX content where every single user that comes to the website will interact with this content. You probably want to kind of polish that a little bit more. Maybe you want to transcreate it. Maybe you want to kind of pull it apart and put it back together in a different language. So this is kind of where you basically can save the time from humans, from human experts, from linguists, and then invest their time into this more important content, I would say. I mean, I don't want to say more important. I think all this content is important. But at the end, it's just about the exposure and the use of it, right? And what is the purpose of it?
I guess it just like it could be looked at the way like how much effort you need to be able to deliver what it needs to deliver. So maybe if it's just instructions, maybe just a little bit of post-editing is enough. If, as you said, if it needs to inspire and call to action, maybe it needs a little push further. So you maybe want people to spend a little bit more like linguist fixing and making it more enticing.
Yeah, exactly.
And maybe sometimes you just need to write it from scratch. As you said, like with marketing, especially, there are different levels. You might need to like recreate a tagline. It might need to be rewritten completely in another market because the translation doesn't make sense or doesn't resonate enough in the target market.
Yeah, exactly.
Because when we talk about AI, or at least in general, again, I'm not sure like it's 100% appropriate, but sometimes it's also about the automation side of things, like when it's like workflows. And as you mentioned, like in that case, you categorize the assets in different kinds, and then they were assigned, let's say, to a different kind of workflows with different steps. So like, how do you balance, or how do you approach this? Like figuring out how much it needs to be automated, how much needs to be, let's say, managed by humans as well. What will be your like recommendation around this?
Yeah, that's also a good consideration. I think it also definitely depends on two things, right? What the type of content is, as we just discussed now. And then also I think it's also worth looking into what is your workflow and process at the moment. And one thing that I noticed that is also interesting to me, sometimes when I join different companies and different teams, I noticed that sometimes in the effort of making a workflow good, we also overcomplicate it. So I think this is where also AI and different new developments can come into play, because sometimes in the desire to kind of mimic this ideal workflow, we can really put too much, let's say, in between of the original content and where actual output or where the linguists are. And I've seen really good examples of how can you use specifically Gen AI for this. Depending on your source content, you can work with source content a bit, make it a little simpler, make it a little bit more error-free, so you can kind of work on that side. I've never seen this actually, but you could probably integrate it into closer to the output. So when you look at QA, for example, you can probably automate a lot of the traditional QA steps, right? So QA, you can do the classic QA where you check linguistic errors, you check some functional and visual errors. And this is where I think I could really help. These are, let's say, simple triggers that you could kind of program to remove the need for human intervention. But then there's, of course, other ways of kind of QAing or checking the content or dealing with it after this workflow where I don't think it's really useful or appropriate, which is really kind of understanding this deep localization and like localization of the user experience. And is this content culturally appropriate? Is it appealing? Is it engaging? I haven't really seen any Gen AI tools that can answer these questions. You really need a human expert there. So these are probably the considerations kind of to keep in mind when deciding where we need to interface AI, right?
Yeah, because the other thing that I wanted to ask you is, let's say, the other side of the coin. So the human side of things, like how the human, let's say, intervention expertise complements AI in ensuring high quality localized content. And maybe, again, like if you can give us some specific example of cases that you've seen in your experience.
Yeah, for sure. I think at this point in time, I think we are still not ready to rely on pure AI or pure neural machine translation without human intervention. I think that's pretty clear. If you talk to any experts, they will say, as I mentioned, that the trust is not yet there. You have these hallucinations that they come up with, both in neural machine translation and generative AI. So the output is not like, there's no way to guarantee that it's 100% correct even, let alone appropriate. And I think where human intervention is invaluable is not only post-editing, which I think is the most common one, right? Like this has been in the industry for such a long time, but it's really kind of stepping into this UX side of things and taking a look at, if you look at website localization or if you look at UI localization, really stepping into a role of the local UX expert and saying, okay, does this website look like that was made in Brazil originally, not in the US? Or does it look like it was made for German users? Like really kind of not focusing solely on this one piece of content and this one string, but kind of adding this real human experience to it, right? I think in this area, we are really far from having AI be able to do this. So this is where the human involvement could really lean into, I think.
And what about, again, like you said, like in preparation, you mentioned like the AI could help with some, let's say, preparation task. But what about the human intervention in previous stages, even before it reaches the localization? I know that sometimes it's really useful. You can get really useful input in previous stages of the development process.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, this I can kind of answer from a perspective of my copywriting team that I had. So in my previous role, I also managed the UX writing and the marketing writing team. And I mean, they also used Gen AI in their tasks, right? Because I think there's also this common misconception that copywriting is just about outputting copy. There's a lot of work that comes before that, right? There's all this research, there's all this different ways of phrasing things. You draft something in 10 different ways. You want to simplify it, you want to expand it, you want to get different takes on it. And this is something where I think it's so useful. I mean, some of them really enjoyed having kind of ChatGPT as a sparring partner, asking it to like review, cut down on their copy, summarize, expand, do bullet points. So these are all the things that, of course, impact us in localization as well then, because this is the source text that we work with. So yeah, for sure, there's so many use cases there. Yeah.
Yeah, you can get a brainstorm. Like you can do a brainstorm with just you and the computer.
Exactly.
You can bounce the ideas off each other's.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Also to keep in mind, as we mentioned, it's not brilliant, but it does help you, kind of bounce ideas and maybe to unblock you, because this is also sometimes a problem, right? You can get really blocked and stuck in like this one solution that you're trying to do. And I think it can be a good sparring partner there for sure.
Yeah. And it's always good to keep in mind that it's usually what you get. It's most likely going to be just a draft. Like you cannot like take it and use it right away. It's definitely going to be, but as you said, like might help you explore some angles that you didn't consider. Maybe they're not brilliant, but it didn't occur to you. That's it.
Exactly.
Okay, so I think for today, that's it. I don't know if there's anything else that you think we should mention before wrapping up. That's something we didn't discuss about this topic that you think will be really important. Apart from stressing again, like we still need humans. Machines are not going to replace us yet, luckily, I'll say. But I don't know if there's anything else that you would like to add to this specific topic or any recommendation in general.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it's just such a nascent field and it's so developing. So we really, it's just exciting to observe where it's going to go. And we really don't even know, what are all the potentials and then use cases. So it's definitely exciting and a little bit scary at the same time. But I think we're still in a very good place. And we just maybe sometimes have to reconsider what value we bring to specific tasks. And I think the direction for now is good. I think it enables people to focus on more complex tasks and more valuable tasks. So yeah, definitely an interesting time to be alive.
Oh yeah, it's definitely, we don't get bored. I'm sure that's and I think the localization industry is well placed to tackle, because as you said, even with the fact some of the stuff that is happening now with the generative AI feels a little bit like a deja vu for what happened in the localization industry, as you said, when Neural Machine hit the localization industry, 2016, 2017. It was a lot of reactions as well were very similar. People scared, we're not going to need translators anymore. That didn't happen, and it's not going to happen anytime soon. But still, basically, we paid peace as an industry. I think with machine translation now, it's mostly integrated. I don't think there's many that still rejected completely, because it also it's clearer now that you can now use it for everything. There are specific, as you outlined before, there are specific use cases that make sense, and some cases where it doesn't, or maybe just testing it out and see it doesn't look as good as we expected it to be for this specific kind of text, because that's another thing that we didn't touch upon. Maybe that would be actually interesting about the machine translation training. I don't know if there's anything there that you explain a little bit, but that's training the machine translation models and make it customized, and how that adds up, for example, compared to a generative AI. But maybe there's something else that we didn't touch upon.
Yeah. I mean, we can discuss this the next time as well, but this is also a little bit of a similar process, right? You are always training this foundational model that is kind of the same for both things. And you train it by giving it data. And what is data? It's different corpora of texts that are available on the internet. So basically, it just learns by getting all this input. And then, I mean, for machine translation, there's all these different things that you can do to improve it as a user. From the user perspective, you can implement different glossaries, you can implement translation memories into it. So there's ways to train it specifically for machine translation to get better output. And then, there's different ways that you could train the large language models also to get better output. But at the end, a lot of the process is the same, basically. It is kind of the same way. It's all machine learning. It's all deep learning. So it all learns in the same way, let's say.
Also, I think like all that side of things like training, it involves a lot of humans. So
for sure.
That's like job, like roles that didn't exist before, now they exist. So we're probably going to get to something similar with generative AI, I guess, like the new roles coming up. And I know like in content marketing, like it's going to give more, as you said, like more space for people to focus on creative tasks. That is not only writing content, like all the research, all the distribution. So before and after the planning, which sometimes is always rushed because you have to do everything. Now it just gives you more time to breathe, let's say.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it creates a whole different set of problems, which is what happens when we run out of data to train it, right? Can it be trained on this artificial data that is creating itself? And then you come into this kind of like let's say a rabbit hole of like, is this then when it becomes, the sentient machine that can train itself on its own data, doesn't require at all human intervention, and we really go into this space of uncertainty.
It might be, as you said, like the output now is the average of what has been fed into. So if it's fed into average output, then it's going to be the average of the average. So maybe it's just like it starts degrading after a while.
Exactly. Yeah. Who knows? This we still have to wait and see. Good, nice.
Okay, so thank you so much for joining us today at the Multilingual Content Podcast.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Thanks for joining us today. The Multilingual Content Podcast is powered by Undertow. We help companies translate their content into results. Get in touch if you want to know more. And if you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new episode. See you next time.